Okay? The question here is, how does God judge people who have never heard the gospel of Christ? And I think that the Bible indicates that God judges people on the basis of the information that they have. He judges them on the basis of the light that they have. So that those who have never heard of Christ will not be judged on the basis of whether they've placed their faith in Christ. That would be manifestly unfair. They've never heard of Jesus, so how could they place their faith in him? Rather, Paul says in Romans 1 and 2 that they will be judged on the basis of how they've responded to God's general revelation in nature and in conscience. Paul says, in nature, all men at any time in history, any place in the world, can know that there is an eternal and powerful deity who has created the world. And in chapter 2, he says that God's moral law is written on the hearts of all people, even those who do not have the Old Testament law, so that we do by nature what the law requires. We have an instinctual grasp of right and wrong. And so those who have never heard the gospel will be judged on the basis of their response to God's general revelation in nature and conscience. Now, that does not mean that someone can be saved apart from the work of Christ. What it would mean is that the benefits of Christ's death could be applied to someone without his conscious knowledge of Christ. If he were to look out at the world and say, I know there's a God who's created all this, look in at his own heart and say, I don't live up to the demands of God's moral law, and he flings himself on the mercy of this God, asking for forgiveness and pleading for mercy and grace, that person would be saved by grace through the blood of Christ, even if he had no knowledge of Christ. He would be like people in the Old Testament who had no conscious knowledge of Christ at all, but they responded to the light that they had and were judged by their response to that light. Now, this raises all sorts of questions. Are there any people like this? I hope so. I hope Aristotle gets in. But if you take Romans 1 seriously, I think you have to say there's not very many people like this. Paul says that rather than worship and serve the Creator, people turn to gods of their own making and turn away from God. And rather than live up to his moral law, they plunge themselves into immorality and degeneracy, and so find themselves condemned before God just on the basis of his general revelation in nature and conscience. So I don't think we can be optimistic that very many people will access salvation through general revelation, but nevertheless, I think it is possible that salvation is available to them if they will respond in an appropriate way. And God will judge them fairly and justly because that is God's very nature.